Greetings, fellow Bible readers. Welcome to week 51 of our read through of the Bible. This week, we're going to be going through a number of what are called the Catholic epistles. The reason they have that name is not because they're Roman Catholic in nature, but rather that word Catholic at its root means universal. And these letters were written to large groups of churches that were kind of spread out over bigger areas. This is in contrast to Paul's epistles that generally were written either to individuals or to single congregations. There's one of these Catholic epistles that's quite a bit longer than the others, the book of Hebrews, and so I just want to spend one moment kind of giving a little special introduction to that. The key thought or word behind the letter to the Hebrews that you want to keep in mind is better than. Throughout the letter, the writer of Hebrews is establishing that Jesus is better than the Old Testament covenant and the rituals connected with it that many Jews were tempted to go back to after converting to Christianity because of persecution that broke out against Jewish believers and against believers in general. So let's dive on into the readings for each day. On days 1 and 2, we get Hebrews chapters 2 through 6 and 7 through 10. And in these 10 chapters of Hebrews that start off the letter, after talking about how Jesus is better than the angels and better than Moses, the messengers of the Old Covenant, the discussion transitions into a comparison of how Jesus and the new covenant that he brought and established are better than that old covenant of the Old Testament with all of its worship rituals connected to it. Then on day 3, as we head into Hebrews chapters 11 through 13, the end of the letter, the writer of Hebrews begins to talk about the impact and application for the Christian life of what it means that Jesus is better than, how this bears on the Christian faith here and now on this earth. Then on day 4, we head into the book of James, and James is a letter that is focused largely on Christian works of faith. He talks an awful lot about the way that Christians ought to live in this world. And especially in chapter 2, he makes the statement that a man is justified not by faith but by works. And Christians can sometimes read that and kind of think, boy, there's something strange that's going on because Paul talked an awful lot about being justified by faith and not by works. And so how does this all fit together? And the key thing to keep in mind is that when in chapter 2 of James, he talks about being justified not by faith but by works, he's talking about justification before men. The whole section where that is brought up is talking about showing your faith to people around you, and that really you can only see that faith through actions because people can't look into your heart. And so James is entirely correct to point out that when it comes to our standing before people, the only way we can demonstrate and justify our faith is by the actions that faith produces. Whereas Paul, when he talks about justification, he's talking about justification before God. He's not talking about the proof that other people can see to show that you've got faith. He's talking about how we stand before God, and the only way that we can be justified before God is simply by faith alone, not by our works in any way, shape, or form. And so the two of them really don't disagree. They're just looking at the matter of faith and the actions that faith produces from different angles. So just keep that in mind when you read through the book of James. On day 5, we get into 1 Peter, which is a really wonderful book for Christians still today to read because 1 Peter talks an awful lot about the Christian and suffering and the relationship between those two things, the Christian life and suffering in this world. So as you read through it, just kind of take away some of the points that Peter makes that are useful and helpful for providing comfort when you face suffering in your own life. Then on day 6, we get into 2 Peter, and this letter seems to be written near the end of Peter's life. That comes out especially in chapter 1, and quite fittingly, it sort of deals with end kind of stuff. In the first chapter, as Peter seems to be especially aware of the end of his life, he talks about the reliability of the gospel when there are no more eyewitnesses that people can talk to face, and so the reliability of the written scriptures. Then in chapter 2, he focuses an awful lot on false teachers that Jesus said would come in greater and greater numbers near the end of the world. And finally, in chapter 3, Peter talks about the end of the world itself. So you can't get any more end-related than that. Then finally, on day 7, we head into First John and we get the first 3 chapters of that letter. And what you'll want to notice in this letter of First John is that just like the gospel, John uses very simple, very basic language in order to communicate very deep, very profound truths. For instance, in chapter 1, he uses the contrast between light and darkness, something as simple as that, to talk about repentance and the Christian's relationship to God. And then in chapter 3, he uses the very simple word love to talk about the whole aspect of the Christian life and the way that Christians ought to act here on this earth. So just be aware of that way that John uses language in this epistle that mirrors the way he used it in the gospel. That's all for this week. We'll see you next